I'm very glad to be joined today by Christian Picciolini, a former American extremist who is also the founder of the Free Radicals Project, a global network working to prevent extremism and to help people disengage from hate movements. Welcome, Christian.
Thank you, Brianna. It's really a pleasure to be here.
So this conversation was prompted by feedback I got from a recent episode I did, in which we broached some of the subjects which I think you have some real expertise on, that being this question of how to handle extremism, whether or not we can learn anything from talking to engaging with extremists about how to prevent people from becoming radicalized, and also how to help facilitate people becoming disengaged from extremism. You're someone who, at a tender young age, became recruited, as it were, into a white supremacist organization. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about your background?
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And I appreciate being here too. It's a privilege to be here. We live in a world where there are folks who've done a whole lot less than I have in my life and are still held back as far as opportunities. So I want to acknowledge that. In 1987, when I was 14 years old, I was recruited into America's first white power or neo-Nazi skinhead group on the south side of Chicago. I spent 8 years till I was almost 23 years old, or just when I turned 23 years old, as a part of that movement. At first, as a young boy of 14, I was just a member and just kind of followed along and was groomed to do that, and spent 8 years developing into a leader and eventually a propagandist. Somebody who spread the message and was actively trying to recruit other people into that movement. But I also think it's important to say that, prior to 14 years old, I wasn't raised to be, a racist. My parents are Italian immigrants who came to the U.S. in the mid-'60s. They were often the victims of prejudice when they first came over, and didn't raise me to hate anybody. In fact, they had friends from all over the world, from other cultures and backgrounds and religions even, and I always had exposure to people. But I found my way to extremism because I was searching for a sense of family. Growing up, my parents, as immigrants, had to work extremely hard, so I didn't see them very often growing up. So I went searching for what I thought was kind of a family outside of my real family unit. And I found it standing in an alley in 1987 on the south side of Chicago.
What happened in that alley?
Well, I was smoking a joint and by myself, and a guy walked up to me with a shaved head and boots, and he pulled that joint from my mouth, and he said, "That's what the communists and the Jews want you to do to keep you docile." And I have to tell you, Brianna, at 14, I didn't know, what the heck a communist was. I didn't know if I'd met a Jewish person, and I didn't even know what the word docile meant. But after a few seconds, I realized that this person was paying more attention to me than anybody else had in my life. I, up until that time, had been pretty bullied and kind of feeling isolated and didn't have a whole lot of close friends. And after a few seconds, that confusion of being approached in that alley turned into a very welcoming hand on my shoulder who asked me what my name was. And I was afraid to tell him because growing up, I had a tough last name to pronounce. Picciolini is not an easy one to pronounce, and it was kind of mangled. So it was a point of bullying for me. So when he asked me what my name was, I was afraid to tell him. Because I thought he was going to, make fun of me. And he actually did the opposite. He told me it was a fine Italian name and that it should be something I should be proud of. And, having grown up in kind of an Italian-American family on the south side of Chicago in an Italian-American neighborhood, being Italian was really all I knew. I didn't even know how to be American. So when he told me somebody wanted to take that pride away from me, it scared me. And it was probably, the most effective scare tactic for me because that was the only identity that I knew at the time. And I think it's important for people to recognize that just like me, who wasn't searching for a hateful ideology at that time, most people who find their way towards extremist movements aren't searching for the ideology. The ideology isn't what initially pulls them in. It's instead a search for identity, community, and purpose, something that we all search for at some point in our lives.
And in your book, Breaking Hate, you talk about that ICP, identity, community, purpose, and you give a lot of, you tell a lot of stories, anecdotes about various people you've encountered and work to kind of de-radicalize and disengage, who have these potholes, you call them, these moments in their lives that kind of trigger this desire for identity and community and purpose, whether it's coming from an abusive household, having a difficult relationship with one's father, that there tends to be these moments that set people down that path. But before I ask you to get into that a little bit more, I'm curious, it's probably surprising to a lot of people to find out how many people who become right-wing extremists, white nationalists, what have you, weren't raised that way. And I think a question that probably comes up for people is, well, if you were raised to not be racist, if you have parents that had kind of more normalized attitudes toward Jewish people or Black people or immigrants or what have you, non-white immigrants, I suppose, or what have you, what happened? What happens when this new ideology bumps up against the way that you've been raised and the way that you've been behaving in your life toward diverse groups up until then?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's complicated, right? Everybody's got a different situation, a different upbringing, a different support system, different exposure, different levels of support or privilege even. So, I mean, I think for me, really, my parents are immigrants. So I think because I started to resent the fact that they weren't around, I started to hate immigrants. I started to hate that experience. And I started to kind of, I think for me, going into a hate movement started to develop because I started to hate my parents. I started to resent them for not being there. And then somebody saw that I was open to that and said, hey, here's all this other information that should inform you. And I'm putting up air quotes for, our audience that can't see us right now, that should inform us, because it was misinformation. It was all, conspiracy theories about who was controlling the world and who was controlling government and how those, different people, whether they be Jewish or gay or Black or immigrants or whatever, were replacing what it was that I was supposed to have in the world. And we hear a lot about this kind of great replacement theory that's happening today that, is this fear rhetoric that white supremacists use, saying that, white people are being replaced. And we heard it chanted in Charlottesville and things like that. And for me, it was that fear of not, for me, it was being angry at my parents first, but then it developed into, okay, how can I wrap that whole immigrant experience into other, fear things? And I started to fall for those notions that I was being replaced. So I think it started there, but I think it's complicated for everybody. Some people are raised to be racist. I mean, let's be frank. Some people, just generationally, have heard their parents say things like the N-word, or have heard, groups of people being generalized or, being promoted by stereotypes, things like that. So let's say it how it is. Certainly some people are raised to be racist, but I think most people who end up in those movements may start out life as, kind of with the same, normal situation as most other people. But along the way, they hit those potholes that you talked about and that I talked about in my book. And potholes are trauma. Potholes, can be abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. They can be other forms of trauma. For me, it was abandonment. It can be, job loss. It can be poverty. It can also be privilege. I think extreme privilege is a pothole that, separates us from the rest of humanity. And if we hit enough of those potholes, they detour us to the fringes where all sorts of really toxic narratives exist. One of which, especially these days, that's speaking very loudly, is the far right, because they inject narratives of who to blame for the pain that you feel when you hit those potholes. It's never about your fault or never about the things that really make the most sense. It's about making it about the other who is creating those problems for you. So I got wrapped up into blaming all the pain that I'd gone through, being bullied, being, feeling isolated, feeling abandoned by my parents. Suddenly it was all about immigrants, the Jews, Black people, gay people. They were the ones that were causing this pain for me when I, frankly had never really met anybody from any of those groups. And I certainly wasn't raised to hate them.
Yeah, one of the people you talk about in Breaking Hate is a young woman who was one of two twin sisters, who really interestingly becomes radicalized. And some of her potholes that you were able to identify was that, unlike her sister, she was not as popular, not as sociable. was later diagnosed, and you're very clear to caveat this, and it's obviously true that the overwhelming majority of people with various sorts of kind of neuroatypical diagnoses are obviously not white supremacists and never caused any harm to anybody, but was also diagnosed later in life with autism. And she ended up blaming her lack of popularity, or attributing the differences between her and her sister in their social realm to Jewish people, because she went to a school that had a large Jewish population. A lot of the popular girls were Jewish, I guess, and popular boys as well. And that just became the scapegoat for these other problems that she was having in her social life. Yeah.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. She contextualized all her feelings of feeling isolated and feeling bullied, all rested on the fact that the people she interacted with in her immediate, circumstances happened to be Jewish.
Yeah. And it's interesting because here it's like a twin study, right? It's like these daughters were raised in the same household, and had these very different outcomes. And, you should tell the story, but, they were basically confronted with the fact that their daughter had public profile, had been doing YouTube videos rather, about white supremacy, and were alerted to this fact by Jewish neighbors, right, or Jewish friends or fellow community members, right? What happened there?
Yeah, so this was a girl who was in her kind of mid-teens, underage, certainly not an adult, and because of feeling isolated, really found a lot of her interactions online. And online, she could be whoever she wanted to be. She can get past, the inability to connect with other people in the real world. She could pretend to be whoever she wanted. And she started to, at first, really try and figure out what she was dealing with. She was going to kind of forums to understand her isolation. And while she was there, she was preyed upon by a person who eventually became her online boyfriend. And this person, was a white nationalist who claimed to be, her age, and started to develop a relationship with her and started to communicate with her not only online, but over the telephone, and eventually through, videos that he would send. And this person, that she had met, that she had started to fall in love with online and started to care about, started to create this persona that she believed he was this kind of 17-year-old, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryan boy, when in fact what had been happening was she was being catfished all this time, and there were multiple individuals who were pretending to be this one kind of online identity that became her boyfriend. And she didn't really know that, even though this person was sending videos of themselves professing their love, and later on when her parents found these videos and when I saw these videos, it was very clear to us that they were doctored videos, that somebody would strip off the audio and kind of put their own audio, or they would send these pictures that clearly looked kind of manipulated, through Photoshop. And eventually I found the original images that were stolen from models' websites online and things like that. And as it turned out, this girl was being recruited to make propaganda videos for the alt-right. This team of people who pretended to be this boyfriend, their job was to recruit young girls to be kind of mouthpieces for the alt-right. And they had groomed her to make these videos and were helping her make these videos, and she was becoming quite popular. And what I eventually discovered was who these people were that were pretending to be this boy. One who was somebody that eventually abducted her, who was from California, and an older man. And another person was somebody he was working with in Russia at the time, and a couple of other Russian trolls. And this was very early on, kind of before we started to talk about, what was happening in the election of 2016. But yeah, it turned out that she was being catfished and groomed, and eventually somebody, ended up abducting her while she was doing this. So yeah, she fell prey to predators essentially online who groomed her to become a white nationalist, but had other intentions as well.
So some people are going to say, these are kind of cherry-picked examples of, even yourself, you were a young person. This is a kid who was very, obviously being manipulated. But, where's the agency? People are frustrated with the idea that when you look for reasons why somebody might become radicalized, what you're doing is stripping them of accountability or agency in their own behavior. And I think that's a significant part of why some folks that I recently spoke to might have a more visceral reaction to having a conversation about root causes. I mean, do you deal with that in your work, getting people who are not, are not radicalized, normies, as it were, to be open to the idea of wanting to even engage with folks who have been radicalized? How much of that is part of the challenge for you?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, let me say that I think redemption without that accountability portion is just privilege, right? It doesn't work without that accountability. So part of what I do, and I've worked with hundreds of people, and I've been very successful with the people I've worked with, is they must hold themselves accountable. That is part of the process. Without that, it really is false, in my opinion. And I think that there are a lot of people out there who are not willing to hold themselves accountable and just say, I used to be that, and I'm not that anymore, and life is good now. And that's just not the way it really works, or it should be, because I think without that accountability portion, it really isn't a genuine transformation. And I've been holding myself accountable for 25 years to some regards. Other people have held me accountable, and I've been open to that. And it's been about accepting the fact that I must do that. Right? To even move forward, I must hold myself accountable, because how do I measure progress without saying, okay, this is where we're going to start? So yeah, I mean, I think, but to answer your question more directly, Brianna, there are situations where people can change, and the interaction of other people does facilitate that change. And I've seen that so many times where they've come into contact with people at a very specific time in their disengagement, when it's been very beneficial to kind of put them over the edge to solidify that change more. But I want to say, this is a long process. This isn't something that happens overnight. It didn't happen overnight for me. This was a process of questioning, reflection, of holding myself accountable, the same. And I'm speaking not just for myself, but the people that I've worked with along the way to help disengage. This is something that is almost a lifelong process of making sure you are always moving forward.
Yeah, it's funny because, without being overly referential to the controversy that brought us all here, it does feel like the reality that disengagement work is time consuming is used by some as an argument for why it shouldn't be done, which seems to be an obvious logical fallacy to me, especially if there are not alternatives that are faster or more scalable. And that could be done in tandem, frankly. Yeah. And I'm interested in this question of accountability and what that looks like and what penance looks like, because it seems to me that in a lot of contexts, not just the kind of growth of white supremacy, but whether we're talking about the Me Too movement, whether we're talking about criminal justice reform, where this question of what accountability looks like and people's inability to wrap their brain around what that would really mean or have a conversation about what that would really mean really stymies having a more substantive conversation about how to get just outcomes. Because it does feel like when people are discussing these issues, there's a jump between, there's like letting someone off the hook completely and kind of canceling them permanently. And I don't really blame people from jumping to one extreme to the other, because we don't have a fulsome conversation about what it looks like to be accountable or what we would accept as penance. In a criminal justice context, ironically, because there is prison, like it or not, because we have prison, I think it's easier to have that conversation because folks will say, oh, they served their time, they got out, now let's do rehabilitation. But when there's more of these social crimes, Me Too instances that fall short of criminality, or being a racist, or Justin Trudeau's in the news again for another one of these blackface photos. What do you do when the behavior is short of criminal? Or what do you do in a world where we successfully abolish prisons to make people feel comfortable about accepting people back in their lives and back into society again after they've done wrong? And I wonder what your thoughts are on what true accountability looks like, or what the people in your lives have kind of wanted or expected from you as you stepped away from, the extremism that you were a part of in your youth?
Yeah, it's a really important and a really deep question. I don't know that I have the answer to that. I can tell you what it's been for me. For me, it was holding myself accountable before anybody else did, right? Nobody outed me. Nobody, 25 years ago said, here's this guy's address, or he's a not. I mean, I took the steps on my own to say, hey, I'm a bad guy. I've done bad things. I don't want to do that anymore. I need your help.
Did you think of yourself and describe yourself as, hi, I'm Christian and I'm a Nazi?
Yeah. It was, very much like standing up at, Alcoholics Anonymous, though I've never been, how I, kind of seen it portrayed as, I'm Christian and I'm a hater, standing up and saying that. And that's almost exactly how it happened for me the first time I said it publicly. Actually, the first time I said it publicly was in it was like 1999 or 2000 was like the first time in front of a group of people without having to do so is when I did it. It was at my first class at DePaul University. It was a writing class, and we had to write a one-page thing about ourselves. It was kind of like a mini biography. And everybody was talking about, their kids or, the things that they've done, the sports that they played. And I was, for the first time in my life, stood up in front of people that didn't know who I was and didn't know anything about my past, because I had been running from my past up until that point. And I said, what I'm about to tell you is really important, so pay attention. And I told people what I had done for, 8 years prior to that. And I think that maybe that's part of it, right? Nobody forced me to do it. Nobody caught me, in a lie. And I very willingly kind of made myself vulnerable. And I said, I need your help. I don't know what to do from here, but I know I don't want to do that anymore. And people, that's when they said, okay. Some people didn't want anything to do with me, and that was okay too. And some people hated me for what I had done, and I deserved all of that. But some people said, maybe he's worth it. And, it turns out maybe I was. And I'm grateful for that because they saved my life. I don't know what I would have done had everybody shut the door in my face at that point, because I knew I couldn't go back. I didn't want to go back to where I'd come from, and I didn't know where else to go. So I'm really grateful. But let me just say, if we're talking about punching Nazis or not punching Nazis, sometimes that works, right? Sometimes punching a Nazi, will make that person feel rock bottom and say, I don't want to feel that anymore. And sometimes punching a Nazi will get them to punch you back even harder, right? Or it will push them deeper down a hole where they can't get out. This is not an easy issue. This is a very complicated one. We're all complicated people with complicated situations. And I think that we need to start understanding that one solution is not going to work for everybody. Yeah. But I also, I can tell you some Nazis deserve to be punched, but also some Nazis, who were in that situation probably deserve, to hopefully like people looked at me and said, hey, you're better than you used to be, and I'm going to give you a chance to prove that.
Yeah, I would probably argue that all the Nazis deserve to be punched, but that's
will that change them or not?
The question, right? Like and that deserves is such an interesting word, right? Because I feel like in so many of these conversations, we're having a conversation about deserve, and if we can step back for a minute from full-blown Catalan Nazis. Oftentimes the conversation is really, we're talking about conservatives and Trump voters and people who seem indifferent to the obvious white nationalist dog whistling that is coming out of the mainstream Republican Party at this point, whether or not they consciously subscribe to that particular ideology. And, the conversation is often, well, if you are willing to ignore these dog whistles, if you are willing to go along with X, Y, and Z party when they're hurting these diverse groups in these ways, then you don't deserve our notice. You don't deserve people talking to you. You don't deserve to be recruited away. And, facts. No one deserves anything. And what to me is so interesting about it is that I am not Mother Teresa. I'm not motivated by some sense of benevolence to walk around and usher people back from the brink. I have a political project. I want healthcare. I want a $15 minimum wage. There's one group, there's a political path to getting there, and I want to recruit people to that path.
Yeah.
And so I want to meet them and talk to them and convince them, those who are convincible, not everyone is, but all you need is 51%, right? And so it's frustrating to me at times that the locus of the conversation gets shifted to the moral merit of the folks you're trying to talk to, as opposed to the societal outcomes that we want. And when we're talking about the growth of white supremacy and the growth of hate crimes and people truly, your chapter on Dylan Wolf was chilling. People are suffering in a real way. And to hear someone want to talk about how to de-radicalize folks that are causing real harm and frame that as being indifferent to the harms that are being caused by those people, to me seems so backward and short-sighted.
Yeah, no, I think to be clear, nobody who is causing harm to anybody else, either knowingly or unknowingly, deserves a chance, like a helping hand out, right? What I think we need to do is, if somebody is willing to take a step forward and say, I don't want to do that anymore, then I think, it's up to us to decide, do we want to give that person a chance to prove themselves? I don't know that we need to spend, and this is somebody who does disengagement work for, I hate to say a living because I don't charge for it and I don't make any money from it, but I've focused on disengagement work for a very long time. And I'm going to tell you that nobody in those worlds who is causing harm deserves a chance, right? Mm-hmm. They haven't earned it yet, right? They haven't earned it. But there are some people who will walk out from that world. I don't proactively go after people and tap them on the shoulder and say, you're a hater, let me talk to you. I don't do that. They have to come to me. And that's because it's so important to me that they're taking that first step, that means that they're serious about it, at least a little bit, right?
Well, you say that, Christian, but there is, the last chapter of your book, you talk about your meeting with Richard Spencer, perhaps one of the most famous white nationalists, made famous by a liberal media who was obsessed with the fact that he didn't look like what they expected a white nationalist to look like, and kind of made a celebrity out of him.
Correct.
And you talk about how there was an event happening in his town, which is like a normal kind of liberal town.
Whitefish, Montana.
Whitefish, Montana. Yeah. And that was where his famous rally that kind of put him on the map happened. And so you were there in that town, and you sent a Facebook post out inviting him to the event that you were at. Can you tell our listeners what happened?
Yeah, so the community of Whitefish had been targeted by him and another white supremacist website called The Daily Stormer. There was kind of a rift. It was like a family affair. It was a rift between Richard Spencer's mother and a Jewish real estate agent that had happened there. And essentially what had happened was the alt-right ganged up on this woman, this Jewish realtor, and in the town, and threatened the whole town. And it was really scary for a while. So the town invited me out to kind of speak to them, to help explain what they might be dealing with at that time. And just kind of in a troll way, I sent a private, I think it was a Twitter message to Richard Spencer. And I said, hey, I'm going to be in your town. You should come. I'm going to be talking about you. Never expecting that he would show up. And of course, he showed up. And nobody knew he was there. He was sitting kind of up in the upper balcony. But I saw him walk in, and I gave my regular talk explaining, kind of the strategies of the alt-right, what to look for, what they were doing, telling a little bit about my story, and certainly talking about him and what had happened to the town. And he tried to ask a question at the end of my talk, during the Q&A part, and I pretty much shut him down because he wanted to shift it and start talking about, the Holocaust and things like that. So I didn't give him a platform, but I also wasn't afraid to engage with him. And in fact, I did spend a little bit of time with him after the audience had left. They were, pretty horrified that he was even there once they figured out he was there. But I did spend a few minutes with him afterwards, and I don't know that I reached him. I don't know, that it was anything more than him coming to get patted on the back for the horror that he had caused to that town. It certainly wasn't patting him on the back, but I think he was reveling in the fact that they were afraid of him. I don't think I reached him. I always hope that I'm planting some sort of seeds with everybody that I have an interaction with, because I think not just the outward white nationalists like Richard Spencer, but there are a lot of white people who are complicit in white supremacy and don't even know it. So I'm always trying to plant seeds with everybody. that I meet about just kind of getting them to understand and look at things a certain way to see how they might be contributing to this. And certainly for him, it was about directly holding him accountable for what he had done. And we walked away from that conversation. We're not friends, we're not colleagues, we're not anything except for he knows I'm here and I know he's there. And I think that was the purpose of that. However, anybody wants to take that, whether someday 10 or 20 years from now, he wants to come and apologize for everything he's done and have to work really, really hard to make a dent in that. Or if it's as much as me telling him, I know that you're there and I know what you're doing and I'm not going to stop keeping an eye on you. And that was, kind of the gist of that interaction.
Yeah. And I do really recommend that book. You're a very good storyteller. I was,
Thank you.
I listened to it. No, I mean, of course it's, the audiobooks make it a lot easier to keep up with my, obligations for guests, but not everyone reads their own audiobooks. So that's helpful. And you do a really good job, and you tell a story very well. The pacing of all of these stories was genuinely gripping. I don't always make it to the end of everybody's book, but I obviously made it to the end of yours. I guess what's interesting to me, and I want to say, I listened to your interview with Marianne Williamson, and you get into a lot of the details of your work, and I recommend people go and listen to that as well. I watched it on YouTube. But I want to have a slightly different kind of conversation with you, because I am really interested in this kind of the philosophical meat of what you do. Mm-hmm. And the reason is because, while it's not a direct analogy, and for all the reasons, it's not useful for us to be conflating literal, avowed white supremacists with your average everyday conservative. Notably, in the story about the twin daughters, when the neighbor comes over to warn her parents what one of their daughters is up to, it is a Jewish neighbor, right? And they're like, well, I'm a Trump voter like you guys, but this is too far, right? Like and lumping all those people together, when obviously there's a set of parents that are aghast and horrified by what their kids are doing, it shows the lack of utility in lumping everybody together like that. But because of what I try to do and what my political project is, you are doing at the extremes what I think all of us politically have to be doing. And so I think there's lessons to be taken that can be applied more broadly, even if we aren't literally talking about how to flip Nazis. And I'm really interested also in this idea of shame. I want to read a passage back to you from your book. Mm-hmm. You say, I understand the value of shunning bad behavior as a deterrent and social corrective for the harmful urges humans exhibit. We must confront hate wherever we see it and punish those who've committed violent crimes. That much I agree with. I also believe that violent or hateful people should not fully enjoy the benefits of a peaceful society until they are willing to hold themselves accountable for the damage they have caused. But while an individual is assessing the actions necessary to maintain their accountability, we must allow space for rehabilitation and growth to occur, or we risk adopting the same type of intolerance extremists are guilty of. We must be careful not to become so blind in our position of hate that we embody the very things we hope to eradicate. In an era where moral arguments often play out over social media, this can be difficult. Where extreme judgment thrives, or what some call virtue signaling, a pejorative for the expression of moral values with little substance beyond words to back it up, it can sometimes prove impossible. Too many times I see sincere individuals who are hoping to abandon their extremist mindset get shoved back into the arms of ideology by anti-hate activists who subscribe to a social punishment-oriented philosophy of boycotting past indiscretions as irredeemable sins. A cancel culture that is itself extreme in its rigidity and lack of nuance. I gotta say, I'm on board. You were speaking my language here. I wrote an article on the politics of political shaming many years ago at Current Affairs. There's stacks and stacks of psychological research to back up that when you shame people, it causes them to retreat as opposed to kind of own up and want to be accountable. And that there's a psychological difference between even guilt and shame, guilt being a more socially adaptive kind of emotional response that provokes people to want to change their behavior because it doesn't strike at the core of the ego. The thing you did was irredeemable, not who you are, right? Mm-hmm. Shaming someone and saying you are irredeemable says, well, what my options are to believe you and then I'm screwed, or I don't believe you and I keep doing what I'm doing and I go deeper into the hole. Why is this what seems to me to be so obvious? Why is it so hard for people? Why do you think it is that we end up with so much of this virtue signaling, which to your point, I think is really empty. It's empty. It is performative in lieu of, I think, the harder thing, which is meeting people with some degree of compassion with the goal of changing them in a way that's societally beneficial. Compassion, a kind of selfish compassion, frankly, because it's for us, not for them.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there are levels, right? Like, if we take prison, for instance, and we talk about guilt, you said guilt versus shaming, right? We send people to prison when they are guilty of a crime, right? And then we continue to shame them for decades and decades after they get out of prison with the fact that they're not allowed to get certain jobs, that they can't vote, that they can't, participate in ways that we've, supposedly been rehabilitating them to be able to participate in. The truth is we don't rehabilitate people, and we don't allow them to participate after they've kind of served their time.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's complicated. I think certain people are being very performative, and they're almost, condemning other people because they're guilty of certain things that that they're using now as kind of like a weapon against other people. How many times do we hear about, so many of these, people who are loudly homophobic end up, they're covering up the fact that they've been, living that lifestyle secretly. And it's kind of like a way to cover up how they feel guilty about something. So I think you see a lot of that in hate as well. I don't know. I mean, I think as human beings, we're complicated right now with the kind of injection of so much content, so much media, so much influence coming at us, especially during a pandemic in the last, 19 months, where we've all been kind of inundated with, opinions and editorials from a million different people. We seem to all be developing the same opinions on everything on one side of the spectrum or the other, right? We're deeply polarized, but we're all of those same, kind of polarized opinions. There really is no nuance anymore. And that scares me, to be honest with you, because I feel like we are in this moment where it's a super important moment for us. I don't know, if we are going to survive this polarization, this constant attack against each other. But I also don't know what the answer is necessarily to bring us all together, except maybe to understand that we all share some of the same brokenness, and maybe that knowledge of us sharing that same brokenness is the universal glue that eventually can hold us all back together. I don't know, Brianna. I mean, I think that this is a moment we're all trying to figure out, and all have different kind of opinions on how to get there.
Yeah, I don't mean to, ask you to solve the existential crisis of our time. I mean, I'm always trying to just work it out on the podcast too. I mean, your point about people performativity covering up their own kind of guilt resonates with me, because what I have found is some of the people who are most strident in their objections to some of the, political ideas that I have are themselves what I would consider to be politically moderate in a way that actually ends up hurting me more than any given Nazi is likely to hurt me in the course of my life on an institutional level, right? So liberals are very good at saying, institutional racism is the real problem. Racism isn't just some guy in a KKK hat. I don't know what a KKK hat is supposed to be, a hood, I guess, or what have you.
Yeah.
What is a red KKK hat?
Well, Make America Great.
Got it. Sorry. I'm like, I don't know this iconography. What have I been missing? I know about like a little like fez or like a red beret that the Medicare for All people have. Like, what is the red?
It was very much about role playing in the Ku Klux Klan. If I told you some of the names that they use for their like leadership positions, like the Grand Cyclops and things like that, it is very
Grand
very
Cyclops,
much like live action role playing kind of.
I mean, everyone likes a LARP. Just hopefully some slightly less. Do Zelda, do Star Trek. But what's frustrating to me is that like it does feel like, well, if you were so good at identifying that structural racism is the biggest impediment to equality for historically marginalized groups, then why the objection that, I mean, like that to me, that's the real focus of my ire, right? It's not that I am not extremely negative on Nazis, do you know what I mean? But my daily focus and passion is the ways in which someone like, Joe Biden, architect of the crime bill, has had a much bigger effect on the outcomes for my life and my family's life, over the past 30 years than any incidents of hate crime. And that's not any incident or hate crime. And that's not to minimize the gravity of those incidents or the possibility of those incidents could grow in frequency as we're seeing right now, and the need to address and focus on those things as well. But to be kind of asked by someone to be more angry at that, while at the same time, they're displaying what I feel to be insufficient anger at what, in my experience, is causing the most harm to me and my community, is a strange kind of gaslighting that I found to be the most unsettling part of the whole controversy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can tell you that every Nazi's point in spewing propaganda is to get you to meet in the middle, because they're going to come from the most extreme portion, part of their belief system. And if they can get you anywhere close to that, they've won, right? So there is a real danger in quote unquote meeting in the middle, right?
Well, who's meeting in the middle? Who's ideologically meeting in the middle? What does it even look like to meet in the middle of a group that explicitly wants a all-white nation or a genocide or what have you? I mean, I don't even know what those conversations look like.
I think meeting in the middle means voter suppression. I think it means agreeing to certain things that, to not, pass certain things in politics. I think it means not having certain conversations. I think it means agreeing with, immigration policies that are inhumane in certain cases. That's meeting in the middle. We've been doing that in this country forever.
So that's an interesting question. So again, we're in this space where it's like, are we talking, Nazis? Are we talking conservatism? And some people will make the point that there's just the reason we keep conflating these things is because they're too intertwined at this point. And I mean, this is like a whole big political conversation where I guess the question is, what do you see as the motive of a conservative movement versus what do you see as the tools they're using to get to where they want to be? So there are some people who will say conservatives at the very top, they're racist, they're anti-Black, they're anti-Semitic, they want an all-white world, and so that's what the objective is. And voter suppression is motivated by racism, and not wanting to raise the minimum wage is motivated by racism, and everything is motivated by racism. And there's another camp that will say we live in an oligarchy, people are driven to protect elite financial interests, and since the dawn of America, race has been weaponized to that end. And we will exploit these factions that emerge along racial lines. We will create and teach people to balkanize themselves in these ways in order to prevent them from noticing the ways that they're being exploited economically, right?
Yeah, I think it's all, I think if we take race out of the equation, this is ultimately just a class war. I think that, capitalism is driving a lot of this. So, yeah, I mean, I think that, people who don't have necessarily, a lot of money, who don't, if we're talking about people from the South who were part of the Klan in, the 1890s or early 1900s, I mean, there were certainly people of extreme privilege who were Klansmen, and there were people who, were poor farmers who were Klansmen. There may have been people who were sharecroppers, working next to Black sharecroppers who were just as racist as, a bank president back in those days. I don't want to generalize about what's driving conservatism and say it's racism, because certainly I know people who are conservative who I absolutely know are not racist, but are driven by some of the same kind of things that would make them complicit with somebody who calls themselves a white nationalist, being,
right,
so pro, or so against immigration, and looking at it in a very black and white way. Again, everything is really complicated. So I think we can't paint, one whole side with a brush, because I can tell you that there are folks that I know that would call themselves, liberal, who, while they, or let me take a step back, Brianna. Let me just talk about abolitionists. Abolitionists back in the day, we tend to think of abolitionists as people who were against slavery. And yes, they were against slavery, but they also were very quick to usher people who were slaves out of the areas because they didn't want to live next to Black people, right? Mm-hmm. They wanted to get rid of slavery so that they could send Black people, quote unquote, back to Africa or back to where they came from, right? So there are people, I think, who are really complicit in this idea of white supremacy, and it doesn't matter where they kind of think that they sit on the political spectrum, are still complicit with it. And I think what we need is a very hard line, and say that we can't just be not racist, we must be anti-racist. As part of our democracy, as part of everybody is created equal and everybody has an opportunity. If we are going to live up to what we've been preaching for hundreds of years, we are essentially an anti-racist country in words only and not in action.
Yeah, I was thinking about anti-racism earlier at the beginning of our conversation when you were talking about, not being raised in a racist household and then falling into the crowd that you fell into. And I remember I thought to myself at that moment, would it have made a difference if instead of being raised in kind of a not racist household, you'd been raised in an anti-racist household? Is anti-racism, which, some folks on the left, kind of sneer at a little because there are some people in the anti-racist space who I think have a really simplistic analysis that excludes class, and therefore it gets kind of politically weaponized in destructive ways. But if you just take it at face value for what it means, the idea of being proactively anti-racist, do you think that would be a meaningful balm against these kind of recruitment efforts? Do you think would have mattered in a case like the case with the twin girls?
No, I think not, unless it's a complete societal shift. We still live in a country with, systemic racism and institutional racism, and that, is a breeding ground for future racism. I don't know that we can eradicate it unless we, eradicate it institutionally and systemically. I don't think that, we can convince people to not fear, that things are being taken away when they still can't access things like healthcare and education. You were talking earlier about all the things that you work for, and I think wholeheartedly, all the things that you work hard for are all the things that are going to counter extremism in the future in a large part, right?
Access for too.
Everybody
but
to
other people don't agree.
Access to everybody to healthcare, access to mental health care, access to jobs. Yeah. Those are all the things, because happy people don't become extremists. I know that that's making it sound overly simplistic, but happy, full of joy, whole people aren't looking to join a hate group, aren't looking to marginalize somebody. I'm not talking about rich, I'm not talking about privilege, I'm talking about full of joy, people who have all the things that they need, like family, like access to support, access to help, access to education. Those are the types of things that make people whole. And if we have that, that is what pushes out people's ability to want to gravitate towards extremism, because uncertainty, that's the number one ingredient that really pushes people towards extremism.
The word that got thrown around in the post-2016 election days was precarity. And the argument was all the liberals lined up and said, it's not economics that made Trump happen because his voters were disproportionately more affluent. And it's like the world collectively just forgot what precarity meant. Like the studies were not assessing how affluent you were. They were addressing whether or not you felt like there was a risk of you falling off. And all of that, like white extinction, whatever replacement theory stuff is rooted in feeling like this generation is not doing as well in the last. Our status is being threatened. Status threat is literally what the argument was. And everyone collectively pretended that it was just a pure raw poverty metric because it enabled them to pretend like what was motivating people voting for Trump was something essential. There's this really, I think, illiberal desire to attribute people's political motivations to something essential to their being, that makes them irredeemable in a way that is like also really bizarre. Because I'm like, half of you white people, like half your families are Republican. You've always been Republican. All people who Trump voters are just Republicans. They're just the same people who have always been Republican. And you had no problem with them until they voted for Trump. I've been mad at them forever. But you guys just like woke up and decided that we were all supposed to be foaming at the mouths over these people who are the same people that they've always been. And that's not to excuse or anything, but it's like nothing new happened. It just became obvious to you guys for the first time or something because he was impolitic, he was rude, he was embarrassing, And to me, the bad thing about Trump wasn't that he was embarrassing. It's the same kind of conservative neoliberal project that has always been a problem, and frankly is all too common on the left among Democrats as well.
Yeah, I mean, listen. I think that I think America, just in general, has an issue right now. Has a problem with the uncertainty, or what we were talking about just now, and the fact that we don't know what the future holds. We, as a country, and I talk about identity, community, purpose for individuals being something that might lead somebody towards extremism. Well, America has a real crisis right now with its own identity, community, and purpose. We don't know who we are. We don't know who our people are. We don't know what we're supposed to do, in terms of domestic policy, foreign policy, and we've got a whole lot of historical potholes along our nation's journey that we have yet to address. That we can't even name, that we can't even agree on right now. We're living in a time when we can't even be on the same page that there is a racism problem, that there is a problem with polarization. I mean, until we can name that, until we can call it, we're not going to ever fix it. And I fear that, because of that, we are becoming, as a nation, radicalized, just like an individual might be if they're dealing with potholes and suddenly somebody's pitching them this lottery ticket of an idea that's going to solve all their problems. So I think we are, kind of under a magnifying glass right now, looking at ourselves as a nation, just like we are, each other. And I think that we are in a very existential moment right now. And I hate to use that word because it's so overused, but I really do think this is a very dangerous moment for democracy.
When you mentioned, when you say, happy, fulfilled, joyful people aren't so easily radicalized, not seeking out these kinds of communities, it reminds me of the observation that kind of provoked the disagreement that I had with Talia, which is that when I was reading her book and I was reading her description of the men that she was interacting with on these white supremacist dating sites, they all seemed so unhappy. And she does a really good job explaining how these sites have such a hard time recruiting women. They hand out these pamphlets. They ask men who join the sites to go out and recruit for the sites because they just are struggling to find women to even get on here. One of the men she described as having this really unhealthy, imbalanced meal every single day, doesn't seem to have any kind of community, etc. And because that came out of her narrative, I asked her about it because it seems to me that there is a relationship. There's an obvious pattern among a lot of these people, not to a T. Obviously, Richard Spencer, to your point in the book, went to great schools and is obviously able to clean himself up and present himself in a way that makes liberal journalists swoon. I
think it makes people easier to recruit, right? I think if you're dealing with issues, right? If you're eating an unhealthy meal, but there are a lot of people who do that stuff who aren't Nazis, right? They're miserable, they have a bad job that they hate, and they're not expressing it in ways that hate other people, but that means that it just probably hasn't crossed their path because somebody like that is really susceptible, I think, to a narrative that promises them that their life could be better if they just kind of believed something else. If they just were to say, this is the cause of that pain, right? This is why your life stinks. And some people, not everybody, but some people will say, hey, you're right. And I'm going to start looking more into that, or I'm going to start, reading QAnon stuff, or I'm going to start reading Nazi literature or whatever. But just know it's not, just like they're not going to hook you with heroin on day one. It's like a little bit of taste of something that gets you down the road, and then eventually, down the road, you're starting to, talk about Jewish space lasers or something ridiculous like that.
Yeah, you read about how the recruitment happens on some of these gaming sites where you'll be in a big room and somebody will throw out the N-word and get a sense of who reacts in what way in the room. And then they'll make a smaller room and invite the people who seem to have a positive reaction, and it winnows down until you get people who otherwise might not have sought out that kind of a space feeling validated by a space like that. And we've had people write very persuasively about kind of online culture and the overlap with the incel movement, incels and white supremacy. And on some level, there's a tolerance of that kind of a conversation. But if you take it too far or talk about it too much or talk about those kind of root causes, then it becomes, well, so-and-so was sad and depressed and they didn't become a Nazi. Therefore, that's not an excuse. And I think what's important is that, I don't know that no one's looking for an excuse. Who's trying to excuse anybody? I have no interest in excusing a Nazi. I am trying to figure out what triggers exist in society and get rid of them so that there are fewer Nazis?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it was somebody walking up to me in an alley and pulling a joint out of my mouth at the right time, at the right moment.
It was 1984. It wasn't
Right.
going to be online, Christian.
Right. But, online, it's a whole lot easier. I mean, the internet is a digital alleyway. It's kind of like it could be a hate buffet that's open 24/7 if you want it to be. Right.
Yeah.
And yeah, absolutely. Not everybody, who is sad and unhappy is going to become a Nazi. But my guess is a lot of people who are sad and unhappy are not going to treat themselves very well, but they'll also probably not treat other people really well. They may not develop an ideology, but they may also, find really other toxic ways to express themselves. So I think we just have to. So we have to do better. We owe it to each other, I think, to provide access to tools and resources where people can help themselves, and we can also help them if they need it, right? And if they still are unhappy and want to become a Nazi, well, then that's what they're going to do. And I'm not sure that there's anything we can do about that. But why not from day one, in a prevention sense? If we're talking about somebody who is just born, right?
Yeah.
Why can't we do all we can to give them a solid foundation, access to healthcare, mental health care, job, education, all those things? Why can't we as a society do better to make sure there are less opportunities to go into a hate group or to join, ISIS or to, join a street gang or to do anything? That's what we should be doing. So we should really be focusing all of our efforts on something that is scalable, and that's prevention. Maybe disengagement is not scalable. Maybe spending, 5 years with somebody to get them to stop being a Nazi like I've been doing is not the right approach. Unfortunately, because of my experience, that's kind of where life has put me. I'm easier to talk to because I used to be in their shoes. They've seen that I've been able to succeed, so they think it's an opportunity for them to be able to do that. But they also think that I'm going to be a pushover sometimes. They think like, hey, bro, like I'm cool. Can you help me get my tattoos removed because I'm not that anymore? And the first thing I say is, what have you done to prove that you don't deserve that swastika on your chest and to be a pariah, to the rest of the world? Because I'm not going to give anybody a free pass. Just like I wasn't given one. I think people have to work hard for their redemption. Otherwise, it doesn't work. I think if they're given a free pass, eventually they'll find another way to be a jerk to somebody. Yeah. It may not be going back in, but they'll find another way to take advantage of somebody, and they won't do the work to actually, repair the damage that they've done. That's what I've been spending 25 years doing, is making sure I repair the harm that I caused. And part of the way I do that is by, one, Nazi at a time, trying to disengage them. And I just don't know that is the right approach. I feel like if we don't cut the head off the metaphorical snake, there will always be a tail to chase. And I think we have to hold people accountable. What's
funny is I wasn't familiar with the term disengagement, or whatever term ended up getting used in that last episode until you brought it up. I was asking about root causes because, root causes are relevant to prevention as much as disengagement. It's really, to me, a conversation about prevention. And it was surprising to me that it became this conversation about how to convert people. Because I think identifying patterns through the anthropological sort of work that she was doing are just as relevant to preventing people from going down that path. But I did want to ask you before we wrapped, you mentioned that the way that you got was the way that a lot of people get in, which is through these relationships, or feel it because of their kind of negative feelings about their relationship opportunities. Can you walk us through what ended up helping you walk away from white supremacy?
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of things, right? I mean, I hit a lot of those kind of pinball things that sent me in a different direction, almost every day. Part of it is I'm grateful I had a family that once they recognized what I was into, dropped everything and did everything that they could to be a safety net for me if I ever needed it. I wasn't ready for it, but they were always there for me, and that helped when I was ready for it. But I opened a record shop in 1995 to sell racist music that I was making. I was a propagandist performing racist music all over the world. And as part of that record store, I also sold, I couldn't go into City Hall and ask for a license to sell racist music. So I just sold all kinds of music. I sold punk rock, and I sold some hip hop and some heavy metal. And it was the people who came in to kind of shop at my store who weren't the racist people I was selling racist music to that really had the most profound effect on me. I started to recognize that I had much more in common with them. And you have to remember, I was 14 years old when I kind of, separated myself from the world and made myself a part of this very small white supremacist world that I was a part of at that time. So I kept myself from a lot. So I started to, at 22 years old, recognize I have a lot more in common. And I like these people who are Black, who are gay, who are Jewish, who are Muslim, a lot more than the people I've surrounded myself with. Part of that was, for the first time in my life at 19 years old, I met a girl and we got married and had a child. And it was the first time in my life outside of the movement that my sense of identity, community, and purpose was challenged, because I had to ask myself, am I a father or a hate monger? I couldn't really do both and be good at either one. A community, was it the one I'd given life to or the one I'd surrounded myself to boost my ego? As far as purpose, well, it was either to kind of scorch the earth or to create a good one for my family and my kids to thrive in. And that started to really kind of put a wedge into what I was thinking. And then I started to meet people, kind of in secret. I certainly wasn't sharing my confusion with my white power friends because it wasn't a safe place to do that. I started to really, find comfort in people who were totally outside of somebody I should at that time have been a part of. And I'm so grateful for them because they, again, knew everything about me, knew what I was doing. And they said, you know what, you're better than that. And I think that they were challenging me without punching me in the nose. I think that they were challenging me, maybe metaphorically punching the Nazi. and I reacted, and I started to really feel very ashamed of what I was a part of. And I pulled the music, had to close my store because it was so much of my revenue. And then for the next 4 years, I lied to my white supremacist friends and said, hey, I just need some time to get a new job, to build my family back, because my wife had left me. She wasn't a part of the movement like I was. And I lied to them and I said, I'll be back. I just need some time. And all I did was run as fast as I could to try and understand who I was, what I had done, where I wanted to go. And eventually in 1999, that kind of came full circle when I met a Black man who during my high school years was the high school security guard there. And just by this, total karmic event, my first job out after the record store was working for IBM, installing the computers at the old high school I went to. And I met this man, John Holmes, who looked me in the eyes and said, you have to fix what you broke. If you want forgiveness from me, if you want to be able to forgive yourself someday, then you better make your life about figuring out how to repair what you broke. And that was when I started to do the things and put myself in situations to ask for forgiveness and to actually do the work to overcome that. And that was really what set me down the path in 1999, 2000 into the work I'm doing today, because I started off self-reflecting on all the ways that I was terrible. Then I started to go into the communities that I'd hurt and ask for forgiveness and ask, how can I help? How can I do better? And ask them, will you please take me in and show me kind of the way to do things? And it was that journey that really led me to saying, okay, I need to go back into the world I was a part of and being a bridge for people who, like me, wanted to leave but didn't know how or couldn't find the resources to do that. I'm not for everybody. I'm not interested in helping Nazis. If they want to stay where they are and they want to continue to be Nazis, well, they can do that. Know that I am not their friend. I am their enemy. But if there's somebody in that group who says secretly, hey, I don't want to do this anymore, well, then I'm going to give them a chance, because I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt that they can fix what they broke, that they can do the work. And if they're not willing to do that, well, then they're not going to get my support. And it's as simple as that.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you talking to me today and sharing your perspective. Undoubtedly, some folks will say, of course, Brianna gets along famously with a former white supremacist when she couldn't get along with your average
leave it to me,
progressive Jewish woman.
Leave it to me, an ex-Nazi, white guy, to mansplain to a Black woman and a Jewish woman. I don't mean to do that.
No, we're in agreement. You don't have to mansplain a thing. The quote unquote problem is that we're in agreement. And I think it's because what really comes through in your book is this really kind of humanistic approach to things and to people. The kind of humanity that I think you would have liked to have been shown, and that your family did show you and enabled you to get out, is what you then display to other people. And like you say in the book, and which I said on the last episode and will say again, nobody is responsible to, no one owes anybody that. Like you just said, nobody owes anything to any white supremacist or frankly any conservative or anything else. But I am interested in extending myself in those ways for two reasons. One, because no one has to agree with me, but I do think there's some basic human value in everybody, even people who are abhorrent to me, whose beliefs are abhorrent to me. I don't, like you say often in the book, no one's born hating.
Well, someone like you gave me a chance, and I'm grateful for that. But I also think as a society, we have to fight white nationalism and white supremacy with everything we've got. And if there are certain people who within that world want to do better, I think we owe it to them. We don't owe it to them, but I think we owe it to us.
We owe it to us. Yeah, it's for us. That's the second reason, is that it helps us ultimately. It's helping me and my community. I should ask you before we wrap, I mean, what do you think? And again, I said nothing one way or the other about punching Nazis. I was just interested in talking about other things. But what do you make of the kind of, you said earlier, it's not necessarily always the wrong thing to do. But in the book, you also note that there were some people who would be further radicalized by it and who try to bait the left into these kinds of moments because it provides an excuse to have continued bad behavior. I mean, what is your take on the kind of Antifa phenomenon and what it's done to the white supremacist movement?
Yeah, again, complicated issue. What I don't want to say it's something works for everybody, but I think we do owe it to them in the sense that they have at certain rallies protected people from being hurt.
Yeah.
I think we owe it to them for raising with their voices that there is this issue and also holding people accountable. But I also think that it can't be an all or nothing approach because, again, there are some people who, like me and other people I've worked with, and there are other formers that, that speak up that are genuine. There are some formers who are not genuine. Let me just say that. But to find out who the genuine formers are that want to leave, I think that there must be, like a safe passage to allow them to prove themselves, not safe passage to wash their hands of what they've done, but safe passage to get to a spot, an intermediary position where they can say, I'm willing to prove myself that I don't want to be there and that I can, live a better life and provide, better experiences and not, harm other people. I think we owe it to ourselves to allow that to happen. But I think that we have to be strong, and I do appreciate people who are unwavering against people who are clearly causing harm. I don't think we need to coddle people who are causing harm, but I think that within that grand spectrum of people, there are some people we're going to shake out that I think we owe it to ourselves to allow them to prove themselves.
Well, thank you for that. We'll end on that note. Christian, can you let our audience know where they can find you on social media and also where they can find your books?
Yeah, thank you for that. You can find my books at any bookstore or library or online. I've got two books, my memoir, White American Youth, and my newest book, Breaking Hate, which kind of outlines my disengagement process. And you can find all that information at my website at christianpicciolini.com. And just Google X skinhead online, and I'm the first one who comes up if you can't figure out how to spell my name.
Well, it'll be in the show notes. Thank you so much, Christian. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Brianna. Thanks for having me.
And to the audience, keep the faith.